The fire broke out so unexpectedly that not all the residents had time to react. The old two-story building had already been slated for demolition. In just 2 weeks, the tenants were supposed to move to new housing. Everyone knew the wiring was in bad condition, but no one imagined it would come to this. Especially not at night. People were throwing anything they could from the windows. Suddenly, someone remembered that there was a woman on the first floor who had just recently given birth to twins. Her husband worked as a driver and was currently on a trip. The flames had already consumed nearly the entire building, but the firefighters rushed toward the windows. They found the children quickly and handed them out through the window. At that moment, the roof started to crack. The firefighters retreated. A minute later, the house collapsed. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Somewhere under the rubble, buried beneath a pile of burning debris, lay the young mother of the twins. The boy had suffered less, but it seemed the girl had been badly burned. Doctors worked frantically over them. First, one of the children cried, then the other. The ambulance doors slammed shut and sped off with sirens wailing. They informed Ethan the next morning, as soon as they managed to get through to him. But before he could even arrive, his mother had already appeared at the children's ward. A large woman, there were no other words for Helen. She scanned the nurses in the reception area and said, "You have my grandchildren. Who can I speak to about their condition?" "We have many children here. Which ones are you referring to?" the nurse asked. "Sweetheart, I'm talking about the ones from the fire last night." Helen cast a piercing glance at the nurses. "Hurry up, dear. Call the doctor." The doctor arrived within 5 minutes. He'd been informed that Helen, the dreaded grandmother, had arrived. "Hello, doctor. You will tell me everything about my grandchildren's condition," Helen demanded. "The boy is practically unscathed. He should be ready to go home in a day or two. But the girl, one side of her face is badly burned. Of course, as she grows, we will need to help her heal. If we don't, the scar will be very noticeable," the doctor explained. Helen frowned. No family resemblance at all, and now a scar. It's a nightmare. I was completely against this marriage from the start. The girl Ethan had brought home for introduction had come from a dysfunctional family. Her father had frozen to death drunk, and her mother had worked 3 jobs, eventually burning herself out. Helen had declared, "This girl doesn't belong with my son. You have a future, you have an education, and her, she's from the streets." Helen had insisted, "This is not the kind of woman I want for you." But Ethan, for the first time in his life, had ignored her advice. He'd taken this girl by the hand and left with her. They had ended up living in the house that was now on the verge of collapse. And instead of finding a job as a lawyer, which Helen had encouraged him to pursue, Ethan took a job as a driver to support his wife's extravagant demands. Helen had made it clear, "I don't want to see you or her here anymore." But Ethan stopped visiting. His father, Helen's husband, had tried to reason with her. "Aren't you overreacting? You grew up in the country too. What's your problem with the girl?" Helen replied sharply, "I didn't spend my life just to see my son fall back into the same rut." "Ethan needs a strong woman who will push him forward, not hold him back," she added. Her husband sighed. For a long time, no one listened to him at home. His job was to make money. Lots of it. And that's what he did. Ethan's father was a lawyer, a prominent one, quiet at home, but in court, he transformed into someone else. He made a fortune, representing mostly wealthy clients with significant assets to fight over. Helen had insisted Ethan go to law school and eventually become his father's assistant. But everything changed because of that girl. The son arrived in the evening. He immediately wanted to rush to the hospital, but Helen stopped him. "Ethan, sit down. We need to talk." "Dad, I need to go. How can you not understand? How can I live without Emily?" Ethan started to cry. "Don't get sentimental. You have a son. A son. And what about my daughter? Sophie, listen to me. Listen carefully. You won't be able to raise the children on your own. You'll have to come back to us. I'll try to raise the boy into a man, but the girl, she's burned. Do you understand? She's an invalid, a freak. We can't have such a burden in the family. She won't be of any use. If you want, you can take them both. But then, it's all on you. And bury your wife by yourself, too. That's it. I wash my hands of it." "Mum, how can you say that? These are your grandchildren." "Grandchildren from that girl?" "No, thank you." I hate you. I hate you. I'll do it myself. Ethan rushed out into the street. His mother watched him from the window until he disappeared. Her husband walked up and stood beside her. Helen, what are you doing? I know what I'm doing. This will be better for everyone. Where's he going now? Is he going to do something else? He won't. I know my son well enough. Ethan came back at night, so drunk that he passed out in the hallway. Helen put a pillow under his head and covered him with a blanket. Then she returned to the bedroom. Prepare the documents to give up Sophie, and tomorrow we'll take Samuel. I won't do it. You will. And there's no discussion. Think of your son, and think that at least you can save your grandson. The next morning, Ethan was silent. He remained silent while his mother gave orders, silent when his father had him sign some papers. He remained silent when they told him the funeral would be tomorrow. He didn't speak all the way to the cemetery. And there, when it was all over, he collapsed onto the fresh mound of earth and cried. Forgive me, Emily. Forgive me. Understand and forgive. One day, when I stand on my feet, I'll find her. I'll find her and apologize. Helen patiently waited until her son stopped his hysteria. Then she took him to the car and said, From this day on, your new life begins. In the morning, everyone will find out that the girl has died, so no one will judge you. Someone will definitely adopt her. You have nothing to worry about. You'll stay with your son for a week, and then you'll start working as your father's assistant. I hope you haven't forgotten everything yet. She slammed the back door and sat beside her husband in the front seat. He looked at her, thinking, how did I not realize for all these years that I'm living with a monster? Years flew by. Samuel, for you. This is the most high-profile case of the decade. Samuel accepted congratulations. He was celebrating his big win at the best restaurant in the city. Sitting next to him was his grandmother. She had been the one who had guided him all his life. If it weren't for her, he probably wouldn't have achieved such success by the age of 30. Naturally, Samuel's first toast was for her, for his beloved grandma. Next to her was his grandfather. He was very old now, but still always able to give good advice. Grandfather could rightfully be considered the founder of their family dynasty of lawyers. The second toast was, of course, for him, for the pioneer, the founder of the family dynasty. Everyone clinked glasses, laughed, and celebrated. Everything was perfect. Then Samuel stood again. And now I'd like to raise a glass to my parents. My mother can no longer see any of this, unfortunately, but my father has told me so much about her, and to me, she is always alive. Dad, I want to drink to you. You've always been there, helping. Never married, though you could have had anyone. Thank you for everything. Samuel hugged his father. Ethan's eyes welled up for a moment, but he held back. Men don't cry. He hadn't cried since that time at the cemetery. The people at the table continued to celebrate. Ethan knew this wouldn't be his son's last toast, nor his last announcement. He was simply anticipating the look on his grandmother's face, his mother's, when Samuel announced that he and Chloe had applied for marriage. Ethan knew his grandmother would be furious. Samuel needed to get married already. She even had a couple in mind. There was a girl with a horse-like profile sitting there. She was ugly, silly, but the daughter of the current mayor. She knew she was being groomed to be his wife, but so far he hadn't shown any attention to her. Instead, he was fawning over his secretary. The secretary was only a couple of years younger than Samuel. Yes, she was beautiful, smart, but she was just a secretary. It was almost laughable for such a man to marry someone, well, almost a servant. Samuel waited. He knew that as soon as they announced the news about him and Chloe, the celebration would end. His grandmother would cause a scandal. Samuel knew Chloe was aware of the approaching events, but he was sure she could handle it. Chloe was tough. Ethan watched the guests. All were familiar faces, and no climax seemed to be coming yet, so he could afford to relax. His thoughts drifted back 5 years. At that time, Samuel won his first case. They went to the cemetery to visit his mother. By habit, Ethan placed flowers on Emily's grave, and Samuel placed flowers on the small monument next to it. Then Samuel sat down and asked, Dad, why do you always bring flowers only for Mum? Why never for Sophie? Ethan didn't know how to answer. He couldn't lie or make something up, and telling the truth was out of the question. He simply shrugged and remained silent. Samuel didn't insist, but decided that one day he would come back to this question. The older he got, the more he understood that there were too many dark spots in what had happened many years ago. He couldn't understand why his grandmother was so adamant in blaming his mother for all the sins. He couldn't remember her at all. He was just 2 months old when the tragedy happened, but his father had told him many stories. Samuel understood that his father still loved her, and he also understood that something was weighing on his father, something that had weighed on him his entire life. It was his father who insisted that Samuel should live separately. He said he wouldn't allow his grandmother to turn Samuel into the same spineless man as himself. Samuel hadn't understood what this meant until he moved out of his grandmother's house, and when he realized how good it was to live alone, he thanked his father for a long time. After his son's first case, Ethan decided that Samuel was standing on his own 2 feet. Now, everything would be a matter of technique. But Ethan had other, much more important matters to take care of. He began his search for Sophie, and very soon, he realized that his mother had worked hard. The hospital records said that she had indeed died, but Ethan knew that wasn't the case. He tracked down the doctor who had worked then. The man was already retired, but said he didn't remember anything like that. Ethan had money, connections, but everything had to be kept quiet, so he couldn't uncover anything. He spent almost a year sending inquiries, trying to track down those who were on duty at the time, but it was all in vain. Eventually, he gave up. He had done everything he could. Perhaps Sophie really was dead by now. At the table, the atmosphere began to liven up. Ethan understood that the climax was about to arrive. He prepared himself, raised his glass, and got ready to listen. He understood that his mother had done a lot for both him and Samuel, but he was firmly convinced that this person had no heart. Yes, he treated her as a mother should be treated, but there was no love in his heart. It had burned away when he listened to her speech after returning home. Samuel stood up. The guests were all slightly tipsy by now, but not enough to be unaware that the most important toast of the evening was about to be made. I would like to announce the most important news of the day. And no, it's not that I won the case. It's that I won the lottery of life. 3 years ago, I met an amazing, beautiful woman. In these 3 years, I've realized there's nothing better than a woman like her. As soon as Samuel began his speech, the mayor's daughter stared at Helen. I wonder, what role is she playing here today? Helen calmly placed her hand on the young woman's arm, a gesture of reassurance. No one in this family had ever disobeyed her. Once, Ethan had rebelled, but he paid dearly for that mistake. Yesterday, after the long case was finally over, with Chloe's help, which was absolutely crucial to getting it done so quickly, we filed the application at the registry office, Samuel continued. The guests erupted in cheers and applause. Grandmother paled. Grandpa smiled, though he made sure his wife didn't see. But the mayor's daughter jumped up so suddenly that she knocked a salad off the edge of the table, spilling it onto the floor and herself. She rushed toward the exit, wiping mayonnaise and salad leaves off her clothes. Helen quickly followed. "Don't worry, I'll take care of this, and I'll call you tomorrow." The young woman gave her a long look. "No need. Samuel loves her. I don't want to interfere." "Oh, sweetheart," Helen sighed. "If we could always do what we wanted, we would all live like animals. I'll call." Grandmother returned to the table, her face a picture of grim determination. "Samuel, we need to talk." "Grandma, I know what you're going to say, but I'll answer you right away. Nothing is going to change. I'm doing what I've decided." He kissed her cheek loudly. She was taken aback. Suddenly, she realized she no longer had any leverage over him. Well, except for one. Helen began to cry. "I raised you. I worked so hard to teach you, and this is how you repay me. For what? For what purpose?" Samuel was a bit taken aback by the sudden outburst. He was confused, but his father squeezed his hand. "Son, don't let it get to you. This is just Grandma's impressive acting skills." Samuel looked at his father and realized he was right. So Samuel sat down next to her. "Grandma, come on. It's all right. Let's celebrate everything we've got today." Helen realized she had been seen through. She stood up sharply and turned to her husband. "We're leaving. I won't sit here and watch my grandson bury himself with this woman." She cast a disdainful glance at Chloe. "A nobody, without a family. She thinks she can climb up in the world using my grandson? It won't work. I may be old, but I have enough connections in this city to make her regret this." Chloe paled and stood up, but Helen, with her husband in tow, was already leaving the restaurant. Samuel watched them go, confused. She's angry at me, fine. But Chloe, she's just a stranger. How dare she? He hugged Chloe. She shook her head. Give me 5 minutes. Don't touch me. I just need to calm down. I'll tell them to send the janitor. This place is covered in salad and tears. Samuel stepped back. He knew Chloe could handle her emotions, but she needed some time. A couple of minutes later, a young woman approached the table. She had a beautiful figure, but she wore a headscarf, and her hair was messily pulled back. Her apron was clean, though her clothes underneath looked quite humble. Samuel was furious, his insides boiling. He poured himself a large glass of wine and drank it in one go. Ethan moved slightly away so the woman could get to work. She expertly cleaned up the mess and started wiping down the table. Many of the guests had left to avoid getting in the way, but Samuel stayed seated. The woman, without raising her head, said, "Could you please move over a bit?" "No, I can't. You might want to fix your hair first. It's hard to see where you're wiping with that mess." Ethan gave Samuel a disapproving look, but Samuel was still agitated. Is there really no other job in the city for young women except cleaning floors? Or are you hoping to meet some rich man here? With that figure, it's possible. But the way you dress, you should wear a shorter skirt if you want to catch a rich guy's eye. At that moment, Chloe appeared. She didn't understand why Samuel was being so rude to the janitor. "Samuel," Chloe said. "Wait. I don't get it. Look at this girl. She's good looking, but she can't seem to find herself a sugar daddy here. Maybe you're ugly, and that's why nothing's working out for you?" The young woman froze. Then she straightened up. She wasn't as young as Samuel had thought. Maybe around 30 years old. One side of her face was hidden by her hair, but the other? Samuel paused. Chloe gasped, and the guests fell silent. Standing before them was a woman who looked exactly like Samuel. Identical, but in female form. She stood there, silently watching him. Samuel stayed quiet too. After a moment, the woman spoke. "I'm sorry for you. Is money and status all that matters to you? For me, the most important thing is life itself. Yes, I work as a janitor at night, and during the day I work at a factory, but not to buy another pair of shoes or go out to a restaurant and insult those weaker than you. I do it so that my mother can get expensive medicine and at least move." But you wouldn't understand that. The woman turned to leave, but Ethan stepped in front of her. He stared at her intently. Then he reached out and gently brushed her hair away from her cheek. He already knew what he would find. On her cheek, from her chin, and even a bit on her forehead were scars. She recoiled and fixed her hair. Ethan watched her, and there were tears in his eyes. "Chloe," he whispered. "How do you know me?" the woman asked, her voice trembling. Samuel turned pale. He stood up and walked over to his father. "Dad, who is she?" "Ethan," his father said quietly, "meet your sister, Chloe." The guests whispered among themselves. Chloe looked back and forth between the woman and the two men, utterly confused. She didn't understand anything. His sister? But she died after the fire, right after. Samuel was also confused. "Dad, I don't understand. Chloe is buried next to Mom." But Ethan said nothing. Then Samuel asked another question. "That's why you never put flowers on Chloe's grave?" The woman didn't understand. "What brother? What dead mother? My mom's at home. She's very sick. What's going on?" But she couldn't ignore how much she looked like the young man. Chloe felt scared, though she didn't fully understand why. She ran away, ripping off her apron in the back room and rushing through the back exit. Neither Ethan nor Samuel tried to chase her. Finding her wouldn't be hard. They needed to talk to her. That was all. The guests quietly disappeared, leaving only Ethan, Samuel, and Chloe at the large table. "Dad, don't you want to tell me anything?" "Yeah, it's time." And Ethan began to tell everything from the beginning. About how he met Emily, how he brought her to meet his parents, about how, after college, he became a long-haul trucker to provide for his family, to make sure his little Samuel and Sophie had everything they needed. Then came the fire. Samuel knew all of this already, but he kept silent. He needed to understand why, what had happened, why the child who was thought to be dead was alive, and no one had mentioned her for 30 years. Ethan continued. He didn't justify himself. He was just laying out the facts. When he got to the part where he started looking for Sophie, Samuel interrupted him. "Why didn't you tell me?" We would have had a better chance of finding out something together. Samuel, I didn't want it to get out. Remember, our grandmother had already filed a report, and it was one thing to be sure Sophie was out there, somewhere, alive, but I had no certainty about that. I didn't want to stir things up unnecessarily. I didn't want to involve you in it either. Of course, if I had found any traces, I would have told you immediately. But according to all the records, no children were transferred from the hospital to an orphanage at that time. I decided the worst had already happened, and I stopped searching. Samuel sat there, his hands clutching his head. Chloe embraced him, gently stroking his hair. A heavy silence filled the room. Dad, what should we do now? She'll never forgive us. Samuel, I don't know, but I know for sure that I will find her. I'll go. I'll beg her forgiveness. Try to help. You're not to blame for how your father turned out to be such a coward. I'll go with you. No discussion. Samuel stood up. Just then, Chloe stepped in. Samuel, Ethan, it's 12 at night. The girl is already scared enough, especially since she mentioned her sick mother. You should wait until morning. You'll have more time to find out something about her and the woman she's living with. Ethan sighed. Chloe's right. We need to find the manager and get an address. At least something more. Samuel glanced around, searching for the waiter. The staff was nervously huddling near the counter. They all knew this family. Who didn't know them in this town? No one wanted to be caught up in the wrong side of things. Samuel waved his hand. One of the waiters immediately appeared by his side. Call the manager, or whoever is in charge right now. Okay, coming right up. The manager couldn't say much. He gave them an address, saying that Sophie's mother was ill and that Sophie had been working there for over a year. Apparently, she wasn't married, though who would take her with a face like hers? But that was enough. They decided to go see Helen. They startled everyone when they arrived. Helen grabbed her chest in shock, seeing her grandson, son, and Chloe standing at her doorstep in the middle of the night. What happened? Why are you out wandering around at this hour? Ethan started speaking. Mom, we met Sophie. Helen, for some reason, immediately knew which Sophie they meant. She sank into the chair, her face falling. I see. What do you want to know? Sophie rushed home. Her mother heard her sobbing. She managed to sit up on the bed. Sophie, darling, what happened? Sophie ran into the room, collapsed on the floor, and hugged her mother's knees. Mom, please tell me it's not true. Please tell me you're my real mother. The woman closed her eyes tightly. That was it. Now she had to tell her everything. Sophie, a long time ago, you and your brother were brought to our hospital after the fire. He was unharmed, but your face was badly burned. That family, they only took the boy. You were left behind. Your grandmother, she was wealthy and influential. She made sure you had a death certificate. Then she paid me to leave you at an orphanage. I couldn't do it. I begged her to let me keep you and raise you as my own daughter. She agreed. A week later, I had to leave. I wouldn't return for a couple of years, but I promised I would bring you back with me. I'm so sorry. I couldn't tell you before. I've loved you like my own daughter, always. Please forgive me. Sophie fell asleep as dawn approached. She had thought over so much, cried so much. She didn't blame her mother. But to find out she had been abandoned because of her scars, that was horrifying. It was like throwing a kitten out onto the street just because it wasn't pretty. She was woken by a knock at the door. Sophie got up and went to open it. Her mother hadn't yet gotten up, but she couldn't move quickly. Standing before her were the two men from yesterday, the one who was her brother and the one who might have been her father. What do you want? Sophie, please, let's talk. Let us explain. Let us come in. Sophie stepped aside. Samuel and Ethan entered the apartment. It was very poor, but very clean and cozy. They entered the room. A woman was sitting on the couch, looking at them with frightened eyes. She was very overweight, especially her legs. Hello. Ethan approached her. He looked at her for a moment, then said, Thank you. Thank you for not abandoning her, for not being afraid, for raising her. He said it in such a tone, with so much pain, that the woman just nodded, unable to say anything. Could it be that Sophie would finally get the help she needed? Maybe she wouldn't have to work so hard anymore. As for her life was mostly behind her. But Sophie was young. She deserved to live. 6 months later, Samuel and Chloe got married. They had to postpone the wedding because Samuel wanted Sophie, as the maid of honor, to be there. He had become very close with her, and Chloe reluctantly agreed, despite her noticeably growing belly. Samuel laughed. How could I propose to one and end up marrying three? Chloe was expecting twins. Sophie had just returned from Germany the day before. She had been at the best plastic surgery clinic there. Samuel hadn't seen her yet, but Chloe had already met with her. They stopped telling Samuel many things these days. They said, "You're the groom. Focus on your own stuff." He had reconciled with his father, though the conversation had been very difficult. Samuel had nearly hit him a few times. Sophie's mother had been admitted to a better hospital, and when her treatment began to show results, she lost her puffiness and turned into a very attractive, not at all elderly woman. Samuel saw the way his father looked at her. He couldn't take his eyes off her. Samuel stood, shifting from foot to foot at the steps of the wedding venue. His father chuckled. "What's the matter with you? Don't worry, Chloe won't go anywhere. Now you've got her firmly." "Dad, what's with the jokes?" "I'm just kidding, just kidding." "Dad, have you seen Sophie?" "No, she's been refusing to show herself to us. She said we'll see each other at the wedding." Just then, a white limousine pulled up to the steps. The bridesmaids poured out and then helped Chloe out of the car. Though the dress was wide and unshaped, Chloe's rounded belly was clearly visible. Samuel smiled and rushed to his bride. He glanced at all the guests who had arrived, but still didn't spot Sophie. He kissed Chloe and asked, "Where's Sophie?" "Hey, little brother." He turned around. Sophie stood before him, with her hair up in a high style and her face open, smiling at him. Sophie looked so beautiful, very similar to him, though her features were more refined. "Sophie." Samuel hugged her, and Sophie suddenly started to cry. "Why are you crying? Are you trying to ruin my wedding?" Helen didn't attend the wedding. She said she was ill. Her devoted husband stayed by her side, refusing to be persuaded. "I can't leave her. Yes, she's done a lot of wrong things, but she's my wife." That's how the story ends, friends. Join the conversation below and share your thoughts on this story. If you found it captivating, share the link with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story that will make your heart race. Your support inspires us to create more tales. Take care and see you next time.